It was supposed to be the crown jewel of America's Gilded Age, a sprawling million-dollar estate carved into the hills of upstate New York, built with marble floors, imported chandeliers, and a ballroom large enough to hold 100 guests. Yet one autumn morning in 1912, the staff arrived to find the gates wide open, the lamps still burning, and every member of the wealthy Aldrin family gone without a trace. Plates were left on the dining table. A carriage waited on the front drive as if frozen mid-departure, and in the master bedroom a single suitcase sat half-packed, untouched ever since. Charles Aldrin's rise to wealth was one of the most envied and most quietly feared success stories of America's Gilded Age. Born to a modest blacksmith in 1854, he grew up watching men with power shape entire towns with the stroke of a pen. By the time he was 17, he'd already developed a reputation for having a sharp mind and a sharper instinct for opportunity. He left home with nothing but a worn leather satchel and an ambition that rarely left room for sentiment. As the country's steel industry exploded, Charles found himself in the right place at the right time, and unlike many men, he understood that fortunes were never earned cleanly. They were taken. His earliest deals were small but telling. He invested in failing iron forges, bought them cheap, and revived them by cutting corners. Others were too cautious to consider. Workers whispered that Aldrin paid well but demanded absolute loyalty, and that men who disagreed with him quietly disappeared from the business scene, either moving away or simply ceasing all commercial dealings without a word. By his late 20s, Charles Aldrin had amassed a tidy sum, enough to establish Aldrin Steel Works, which would carry his name into every industrial ledger from Boston to Chicago. The company grew rapidly, but so did suspicions around Charles's methods. Rumors circulated that he bribed inspectors, sabotaged competitors' factories, and manipulated railway schedules to ensure his shipments always arrived first. Even newspapers that praised his tactical brilliance hinted that his success wasn't entirely the result of innovation. Yet no matter how many allegations surfaced, nothing ever stuck. Charles had a way of making evidence disappear and witnesses regret their boldness. He cultivated allies among judges, bankers, and politicians, ensuring that his name remained untarnished in the eyes of the public, even if the private conversations behind closed doors told a far darker story. By 1889, at just 35 years old, Charles had made more money than he could spend in a lifetime. That was when he announced plans to build a grand estate, not merely a house but a monument. He purchased 200 acres of untouched forest in upstate New York, a location secluded enough to shield his family from prying eyes yet close enough to major cities to maintain his influence. When construction began, locals flocked to the site to witness the spectacle. Imported Italian marble arriving on heavy wagons, chandeliers packed in crates of straw, oak shipped from England, and a team of architects who had designed some of the most famous mansions on the East Coast. Yet behind the marvel, there was unease. Workers claimed that Charles often walked the grounds late at night as if inspecting shadows rather than stonework. He dismissed crews abruptly, firing entire teams with no explanation. One foreman reported finding sketches of underground corridors in Charles's study, designs that were never included in the official blueprints. When confronted, Charles stared at him coldly and said, "Some parts of a home must only be understood by the man who pays for it." The foreman quit the next day. When the mansion was completed in 1892, it was unlike anything the region had ever seen. 40 rooms, a ballroom with ceilings high enough to echo, a library filled before the family even moved in, and a private study with a steel-reinforced door. Newspapers described it as the Aldrin Palace, though locals whispered a different name, the House of Secrets. Many wondered why Charles needed such a fortress. Perhaps it was simply vanity, or a desire to immortalize his fortune in stone. But those closest to him, the staff who saw the tension in his movements, the family members who watched him guard the study key like a sacred artifact, believed the mansion wasn't built to display wealth, it was built to protect something. The morning the Aldrin family vanished began like any other, which only deepened the shock that followed. In the years leading up to their disappearance, nothing publicly suggested that trouble was brewing inside the walls of the Grand Estate. Charles continued conducting his business, though he traveled less. Eleanor hosted garden gatherings for local women, always appearing poised but noticeably tense, as if her attention was fixed on something no one else could see. The children, Margaret and Henry, were schooled at home and rarely interacted with townsfolk, which wasn't unusual for wealthy families of the era. Still, something about their quietness lingered with anyone who met them, a certain stiffness, an unspoken rule of silence that seemed to follow them like a shadow. In early 1912, subtle changes in the family's routine began drawing attention. Charles dismissed 3 longtime servants without warning, replacing them with newcomers brought in from out of state. Eleanor stopped attending church, claiming poor health, though the local pastor confided to his wife that her eyes looked more haunted than sickly. Margaret, now 16, was seen only once that winter, standing near the upstairs window with both hands pressed to the glass, watching the snow-covered forest behind the estate, with what a witness described as a look of dread, not wonder. Inside the mansion, the staff sensed an escalating strain. Doors that had once stayed open were kept locked. Charles spent long evenings in his study, rummaging through ledgers and maps, burning papers in the fireplace even when the room grew unbearably warm. Eleanor became increasingly restless, waking from nightmares and wandering the hallways muttering phrases the maids struggled to comprehend. "We waited too long," he warned him. "It's already here." One maid, who was later questioned by authorities, claimed she once heard Charles arguing loudly with his wife, accusing her of speaking to people she shouldn't, while Eleanor insisted someone had been watching the estate from the woods. And yet, despite the uneasy atmosphere, nothing hinted that the family was preparing to flee. There were no trunks packed, no letters written, no consultations with relatives or friends. Their disappearance was sudden, abrupt, as if a decision was made in the dead of night, and the entire household shifted into silent motion. On the night before they vanished, staff recalled an unusual gathering in the study. Charles summoned the entire family inside, locking the door behind them. No one left the room for nearly an hour. Voices were heard, raised, frantic, followed by a heavy thud that caused a lamp in the hallway to flicker. At one point, a maid passing by heard Eleanor whisper urgently, "We can't outrun this, Charles," to which he replied, "We don't have a choice." What happened after that remains unknown. By dawn, the study was empty, the lamps still burning, and the house eerily quiet. The servants arrived to find the mansion abandoned, not gradually, not thoughtfully, but as though the family had been ripped from their lives in an instant. The untaken carriage, the half-finished meal, the open gates, each detail suggested not a careful disappearance, but a desperate escape attempted and never completed. The clues left scattered throughout the Aldrin estate were so peculiar, so carefully chaotic, that investigators could never agree whether they were signs of a rushed escape or a staged scene meant to mislead. The first clue was the dining hall table, a full meal laid out as if the family had been moments away from sitting down. The food was still warm, the silverware arranged, the water in the crystal glasses freshly poured. Yet several chairs were overturned, one with a leg snapped clean off as if someone had fallen or been pulled violently to the floor. Nothing was stolen. Nothing broken except what seemed to be knocked over in panic. The untouched nature of the room made the disorder stand out even more. In the drawing room, a grandfather clock had stopped at 2:14 a.m. Investigators noted that the pendulum had not simply halted, it had been forcibly jammed with a thin shard of glass. Nobody could determine whether the clock was broken during the family's final moments in the house or if someone had tried to preserve that exact moment in time. Near the fireplace, a stack of papers lay scattered. These pages were torn from ledgers belonging to Charles, though oddly, each page carried the same scribbled phrase at the bottom: "Find the mirrored number." No one ever determined what it meant, and the surviving ledgers held no further clues. Upstairs, the master bedroom told an even stranger story. A suitcase rested on the bed, half packed with children's clothes. No adult garments, no valuables, no essentials. It was as though Eleanor had begun packing for the children alone, preparing to flee abruptly. On the vanity, her pearl necklace lay snapped in two, the individual pearls scattered across the floor. One maid claimed Eleanor had worn that necklace every day for years. She would not have left it behind intentionally. On the bedside table sat a candle burned almost to the base, melted wax dripping over a handwritten note. The message was incomplete. Only 3 words written in a hurried, slanted script. Don't let him. The rest of the page was smudged beyond recognition. The children's rooms offered no clarity. Margaret's journal, found open on her desk, contained several pages of neat handwriting, except the final entry, which devolved into frantic lines and scribbles, as if the pen had been dragged across the paper by a shaking hand. Henry's room was undisturbed except for the window, which had been pried open from the inside. Fresh mud on the sill suggested he may have climbed out or been taken through it, yet the ground below bore no footprints whatsoever. The most unsettling clue, however, was discovered in the hallway leading to Charles' locked study. A trail of small wet prints, child-sized, stretched from the study door to the staircase, but the flooring around them remained dry. Investigators noted that the prints appeared as though someone had just stepped out of a bath or walked through a puddle. Yet the bathrooms showed no signs of recent use, and the weather that night had been frozen and clear. Every detail inside the mansion contradicted the next. Warm food paired with cold rooms, locked doors paired with open windows. Signs of fear matched with eerie stillness. The clues did not lead toward one clear narrative. They branched in every direction, each more troubling than the last. Witness accounts surrounding the Aldrin disappearance were as fragmented and unsettling as the clues found inside the estate. Each testimony offered a sliver of insight, yet none aligned cleanly with the others, creating a mosaic of contradictions that only deepened the mystery. The first to speak was the butler, a man who had served the family for nearly 2 decades. He recalled that in the weeks before the disappearance, Charles had become increasingly paranoid. The butler often found him standing by the windows late at night, staring into the pitch-black forest as if expecting someone or something to emerge. When asked what troubled him, Charles responded only once, saying, "They never forget a debt." The butler assumed it referred to business, but after the family vanished, the words gained a chilling weight. A maid named Lillian provided another piece of the puzzle. She claimed Eleanor had approached her 2 days before the disappearance, asking whether she ever heard whistling near the back gate at night. Lillian said she hadn't, but Eleanor insisted the sound was real, soft, like someone calling a child, she explained. Eleanor's hands trembled so violently that Lillian later told investigators it was like she expected something to take shape out of the dark at any moment. When word spread about her statement, locals dismissed it as hysteria, but those who knew Eleanor insisted she wasn't a woman prone to dramatics. A stable hand offered a different perspective entirely. He swore he saw the Aldrin carriage leaving the estate at around 3 in the morning on the night of the disappearance, moving down the old road toward the river. He couldn't see who was inside, but he described the departure as hurried, the horses galloping hard, their hooves striking the stones like sparks in the night. Yet when authorities questioned him later, doubt crept in. The carriage was discovered untouched the next morning, still waiting on the front drive, polished and perfectly prepared. The stable hand insisted his memory was clear, but others wondered whether he'd mistaken another wagon in the darkness. He never changed his story, though he admitted one detail haunted him. As the carriage disappeared, he heard a child crying. The sound, he said, didn't seem to come from the carriage. It came from the trees. Several neighbors living a mile from the estate added their own unsettling testimonies. One elderly woman said she saw a figure standing near the Aldrin's second-floor window the night before the disappearance. A woman, or maybe a girl, she said, though she couldn't identify who it was. Another neighbor, a farmer, reported seeing lantern lights flickering near the woods behind the estate around midnight. At first he assumed it was the staff, but when he looked again a moment later, the lights had vanished, leaving the forest completely dark. Perhaps the most disturbing account came from a distant relative, a cousin who had visited the estate 2 weeks before the disappearance. During tea, Eleanor accidentally let slip that the family had been receiving threats, though she refused to elaborate. When pressed gently, she whispered, "He said he wouldn't come back, but something else did." Her cousin never understood the remark, and after the family vanished, she refused to visit the estate again. Each witness believed they had glimpsed a piece of the truth, yet their stories diverged so dramatically that investigators couldn't determine which, if any, reflected what truly happened that final night. The more people spoke, the more the mystery seemed to expand, stretching into spaces no ordinary explanation could neatly fill. Charles Aldrin's business dealings had always carried a faint odor of danger, but in the months leading up to his family's disappearance, that danger thickened into something far darker. Investigators who later combed through his financial records found that the wealthy industrialist had been quietly moving large sums of money into obscure accounts, some overseas, some under false company names, and some into operations that simply didn't exist on any legitimate registry. These transfers were not the calculated adjustments of a shrewd businessman, they were the frantic scatterings of a man cornered. Several deposits vanished entirely, swallowed into unnamed entities that auditors couldn't trace. It was as if Aldrin had been trying to pay off a debt to someone, or something that refused to be documented. Charles's associates recalled subtle but troubling changes in his behavior. He stopped attending social functions, avoided meetings, and responded to letters with uncharacteristic silence. One business partner said that during their final meeting, Charles seemed visibly shaken, constantly checking the door of his private office, lowering his voice whenever a floorboard creaked. When pressed about a failed investment involving a mining operation in the Appalachians, Charles reportedly muttered, "They warned me not to touch their land," before abruptly ending the conversation. The partner assumed he meant rival businessmen, but years later admitted that Charles's tone suggested something far more ominous than competition. Hidden within the mansion's study were documents that confused even the most experienced investigators. Among them were maps of rural areas where Charles had purchased land through proxy buyers. Some parcels sat near old abandoned settlements where previous owners had vanished under circumstances never fully explained. Notes scribbled in Charles's handwriting appeared beside the plots. "Unstable, don't return," and "once paid in full but not accepted." To the detectives analyzing his finances, these notes seemed like the ramblings of a man losing his grip on reality. To those who knew Charles personally, they felt like warnings written by someone who feared retribution. There were darker rumors whispered among workers at Aldrin Steelworks. Some claimed Charles had partnered with men infamous for their ruthlessness, investors who had funded railroads built on land violently seized from isolated rural communities. Others insisted he'd gotten involved in a secretive circle of financiers who used intimidation instead of contracts, men who believed certain resources and territories were protected by forces beyond the law. When a foreman once asked Charles why he always traveled with 2 armed guards, even during daytime visits to his own factories, Charles replied, "Iron isn't the only thing that can break under pressure." Within the estate's locked basement room, found only after investigators forced open a false wall, was evidence suggesting Charles had been preparing for something far more serious than a business collapse. Shelves lined with supplies, lanterns, tools, crates of canned goods, and several ledgers labeled with dates and names. A single chair bolted to the floor sat beneath a hanging lamp, as if someone had been interrogated or expected to be. What puzzled investigators most was a secondary ledger filled with payments described only as deliveries, all marked with increasing sums, each growing more desperate as the months progressed. The final entry, dated 3 days before the disappearance, read, "No more time. They're coming tonight." To the outside world, Charles Aldrin was a wealthy man facing financial difficulty, but the documents he left behind told a vastly different story, a man entangled with forces he could neither control nor escape, making deals that demanded more than he ever intended to give. Investigators entered the Aldrin mansion expecting to find a wealthy family's residence frozen in time, but many reported that the moment they stepped through the heavy doors, something felt wrong. It wasn't just the silence or the coldness of empty rooms, it was a charged stillness, a sensation that the house itself was holding its breath. Several officers later admitted that, although they were trained to ignore superstition, They felt watched from the moment their boots touched the marble floors. One described it as walking into a room just after an argument, except the argument never ended. The first strange event occurred as investigators made their way toward Charles's study. A sharp metallic clang rang through the hallway, echoing off the walls as if someone had slammed a door upstairs. But when officers checked every room on the second floor, nothing was out of place. The windows were locked, and the doors stood still and quiet. The sound had come from somewhere, yet it left no evidence behind. Minutes later, as they descended back to the first floor, an officer swore he felt a rush of cold air pass by him, strong enough to ruffle the papers in his hand. But the mansion's windows were sealed tightly, and no wind was recorded that morning. Inside the study, the room where the family had gathered on their final night, investigators found the fireplace still faintly warm. That warmth was impossible. Hours had passed since anyone could have stoked the flames. On the hearth lay ashes that hadn't finished burning, as though someone had abruptly stopped feeding papers into the fire. Above the mantel, a portrait of Charles had been removed from its hooks and leaned against the wall at an awkward angle, its surface warped slightly by heat. One detective later confessed that he felt as if the portrait had been taken down in a hurry, as though someone had ripped it off the wall to check behind it. In the children's hallway, odd noises followed the investigators everywhere. Light taps, quick footsteps, faint rustling sounds. An officer walking ahead thought he heard a small voice whisper directly behind him, a single breathy word, unintelligible but unmistakably human. When he turned around, the hallway was empty. He refused to return to that floor alone. Perhaps the most unsettling report came from the basement. The hidden room discovered behind a false wall had no drafts, no vents, no windows, yet investigators described the air as moving, shifting in temperature from warm to cold in a way that made their skin crawl. The hanging lamp swayed gently, though no one had touched it. One detective remarked that the room felt occupied, as if someone had just stepped out moments before and expected to return. Even more disturbing was the staircase incident. While photographing the upper landing, a deputy heard a series of slow, deliberate footsteps ascending toward him, heavy, confident, measured. He braced himself, expecting a colleague to appear, but no one came. The footsteps stopped just out of view at the exact point where the shadows deepened. When he called out, there was no response. When he stepped closer, the shadowed corner felt unnaturally cold, almost damp, as though someone had been standing there moments earlier. Multiple investigators reported that objects seemed to shift between their visits. A lamp that had been on the left table was found on the right. A book left open on the floor was later discovered closed, placed neatly on the shelf. Even the curtains in the ballroom appeared to have moved positions, though no gust of air could have caused it. By the end of the investigation, officers who prided themselves on rationality were quietly admitting among each other that the estate seemed to hold traces of whatever had happened inside it, impressions left behind not just physically but atmospherically. It wasn't simply an abandoned mansion. It felt like a place still occupied by the echoes of a night no one fully understood, a night that refused to settle into the past. Theories surrounding the Aldrin disappearance multiplied over the years, each one attempting to fill the void left by the family's sudden vanishing. The first and most popular explanation was foul play, a calculated attack by business rivals seeking revenge for Charles's ruthless dealings. Supporters of this theory pointed to his erratic financial movements, the hidden basement room, and the ominous note in his ledger. They believed Charles had crossed the wrong men, and that his family paid the ultimate price. But skeptics argued that no traces of struggle, forced entry, or footprints were found anywhere on the estate. The mansion showed signs of panic. Yes, but not of an external break-in. Whatever caused the chaos seemed to come from inside the home, or from someone the family willingly allowed in. A second theory involved the mysterious land deals Charles had made in remote areas of the Appalachians. Some researchers suggested he had angered isolated communities that fiercely protected their territory. They imagined a group traveling in secret to the Aldrin estate, seeking retribution that the family never anticipated. But again, this theory struggled with logistics: no travel records, no sightings, and no evidence of outsiders approaching the estate that night. The land Charles purchased was nowhere near the mansion. Why would a grudge take years to unfold and strike in such a sudden, total way? Another theory dipped into the psychological. Some believed Charles suffered from severe paranoia or a mental breakdown, dragging his family into a delusional flight from imagined threats. The hidden room, the frantic ledger entries, the constant night vigils, all could be symptoms of deteriorating sanity. Perhaps Charles led his family into the woods, convinced they were being hunted. But this explanation collapsed under scrutiny. Eleanor's fear, Margaret's journal scribbles, the strange noises described by staff, and the unsettling clues in the house all implied that if madness was present, it wasn't confined to Charles alone. The more supernatural theories emerged quietly at first, dismissed as folklore, but gained traction as investigators failed to produce answers. Some speculated that Charles had become involved in occult practices, possibly through secret societies tied to his wealth. They pointed to the cryptic messages, the child-sized wet footprints, the unexplainable disturbances investigators experienced, and the references to debts and payments in his ledgers. Others suggested the estate itself was built on land that carried older, deeper histories, ones Charles had ignored or disturbed. The sudden cold spots, the whispers heard by officers, and the shifting objects fed into this idea that the mansion wasn't empty, but rather occupied by something that had finally collected its due. A more unsettling theory focused on the family dynamic. Some whispered that Eleanor knew what was coming. Her comments to staff, her nightmares, the snapped necklace, the half-written warning on her nightstand, all hinted at a woman who sensed an inevitable end. Even the children seemed affected, especially Margaret, whose journal devolved into chaotic lines, as if she were trying to write something out of her mind. If Eleanor understood the threat, why didn't she escape sooner? Some believed she tried, others felt she knew escape was impossible. Despite countless investigations, documentaries, books, and late-night debates, no single theory ever answered every question. The contradictions were too deep, the evidence too fractured, the atmosphere of the estate too disturbingly charged. And perhaps that was the most unsettling truth of all, that the Aldrin disappearance was not the story of a crime, nor a haunting, nor revenge, nor madness. It was the story of something that moved silently through one family's life, tightening its grip night after night, until the moment came when the house they built could no longer hold what waited just outside, or just within, its walls. In the quiet after a story like this, when the echoes haven't fully died, and the details still cling to the corners of your mind, there's always that one question that refuses to settle. Maybe it's the choice someone made, or the truth someone buried, or the shadow that didn't move the way it should have. Whatever it is, if you're still thinking about it right now, you're exactly the kind of person this channel was made for. These dark corners of history, these forgotten crimes, these unanswered mysteries, deserve to be witnessed, questioned, and remembered by those who don't look away. So if you felt something tonight, a chill, a spark of curiosity, the urge to pull the thread a little further, subscribe. Stay with us. Every week we open another sealed door, another dusty archive, another case that was never meant to resurface. And your voice matters here, your theories, your thoughts, the things you notice that others might not. Drop them in the comments. Let's build a place where the overlooked becomes unforgettable, and where every question leads to another path waiting in the dark. Because the next story is already whispering, and you won't want to miss where it leads.